1788. King George III is hallucinating, violent and abusive.
Out of my sight!
He's losing control of himself and the country. This is a crisis. Britain can't have a mentally ill king. As a last resort, a medical maverick who runs an asylum is summoned. Can he save the king? In this series, I'm reinvestigating some of the most dramatic and brutal chapters in British history. It wasn't just one generation, it was 3 generations losing their lives. Bum, bum, bum. These stories are part of our national mythology, harbouring mysteries that have intrigued us for centuries. It's chilling to think that this could actually be evidence in a murder investigation. But with the passage of time, we have new ways to unlock their secrets, using scientific advances and a modern perspective. It's a horrible psychosexual form of torture.
Absolutely.
I'm going to uncover forgotten witnesses, re-examine old evidence and follow new clues to get closer to the truth.
It is one of the great British mysteries.
It was one of those moments, I'm afraid, for a historian that makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck.
I find George III an intriguing king. He was conscientious and intellectually curious. He built this observatory to watch the transit of Venus across the sun in 1769. He ruled for 60 years, but he was plagued by bouts of mental illness which were barely understood in his lifetime. The madness of George III has been raked over for centuries by medics and historians. But I want to look beyond the diagnosis, at the man himself. And I want to use newly released papers to understand the pressures in his private and public lives that may have brought on his illness. How did George and Britain deal with having a mentally ill king? And how did his illness change Britain? I'd say I know a fair bit about George III, but I don't know nearly enough about his mental health. And now's the perfect time to take a look at it, because new evidence has come to light. Just a few years ago, the royal family granted unprecedented access to his personal papers. This treasure trove of documents is stored at Windsor Castle. So far, 225,000 documents, that's diaries, letters, and medical notes, have been published online. But there are still more secrets to be revealed. I've been here to the Royal Archives before, but this is the first time I hope to get my hands on documents that will take me behind the scenes into 1788, when the King fell ill. I've asked the Royal Archivist to bring out a unique private diary. It's an eyewitness account of George III's illness as it escalated.
There we are.
Thank you so much. This is great, thanks. This is an amazing thing to get to see. It's the diary of Robert Greville, journal of His Majesty's most serious and afflicting illness. He was one of the King's equerries, which means he spent a lot of time with the King. And on Sunday, the 9th of November, he's writing about great agitation and much incoherence in thought and expressions. It's fascinating that he's actually with the King. This is like a frontline report from the king's bedside. What else are we going to learn? Oh, finally he goes to sleep after having talked for 19 hours without scarce any intermission. Poor man. So what's happening on November the 24th? We found the king violently agitated and very angry, but more particularly with Dr. Warren, one of the medical advisors. The king advanced up to him and pushed him. So Greville's getting pretty upset, actually. He says that the general conduct of the physicians has not been decided or firm. They simply don't know what to do. They appear to shrink from responsibility. Greville says here that a report has been sent to Mr. Pitt, the Prime Minister, stating that His Majesty had passed a quiet night, but that he was entirely deranged. George had at least 5 personal doctors, and they were all flummoxed. In the 1780s, the medical profession still clung to a centuries-old notion about mental illness. When George fell ill in 1788, his doctors at first still believed they needed to get this disease out of his body. They gave him drugs to make him vomit. They used blisters to draw out what they thought was bad blood from his body. And they used these little suckers. Got these off the internet. I love the way they're actually called little wrigglers. These are leeches. Look at them wiggle. They're just like tiny little monsters. Oh, he's sucking the side there. And the idea was that these would be applied to George's temples and that they would suck the madness out of his brain. The king is bled, blistered, and purged. Nothing works. But if he doesn't get better soon, his illness could trigger a constitutional crisis. In 1788, Europe is a tinderbox. Peter III of Russia has been murdered in a coup, and in France, the scent of revolution is in the air. It's a dangerous time to have a mentally ill king. Investigating the medical mystery of George's condition is not without potential pitfalls. George's illness wasn't just misunderstood in his own lifetime. In modern times, another suspect diagnosis has stuck. This essay was published in the British Medical Journal in 1966. It's by a couple of psychiatrists, McAlpine and Hunter. They looked at George's medical records and argued that he had a rare genetic blood disorder called porphyria. This idea really stuck, notably in the stage play by Alan Bennett. When this was turned into a film, there was actually a caption on screen suggesting that George had porphyria. But historians have been divided about this, and now there's a rival diagnosis. I'm meeting an eminent psychiatrist who led a recent review of the Mental Health Act in England and Wales. He's also been examining the papers from the Royal Archives. Can the new evidence settle the question of what was wrong with George once and for all? Simon, how do you feel about diagnosing dead people? There are some concerns here, aren't there?
Oh yeah, very much so. In medicine in general and psychiatry, it's a very dangerous thing to do. The only reason that we can do this with George is because the documentation's so extraordinary.
Why do you think that porphyria was so warmly welcomed as a theory in the 1960s?
McAlpine and Hunter were, it now turns out, ardent monarchists, and they wanted really to remove the taint, the stigma of mental illness from the family. And Porphyria did run in the royal houses of Europe, by the way. It just didn't affect George. But they wanted to kind of help the Queen out by taking away the taint of mental illness.
What was really the king's condition, do you think?
The best evidence we have from George is the observations of his behaviour. We've had for some time now what we call diagnostic criteria, and in which you can fill in a computer program, and that will then tell you what is the most likely diagnosis.
So you have your computer program and you can put George into it and see what comes out.
You can indeed.
Employment
King. Residence, Windsor Castle, grandiosity. Bit difficult in a king to diagnose that, actually.
Excessive self-reproach. He was a great one for beating himself up.
Poor sleep, very, very common. Reduced need for sleep, reduced appetite.
He's having hallucinations.
Yes, there we are. He's having some hallucinations, which is common in very severe mania. And at times, when he had to be restrained, for example, there was also a lot of violence and things like that. And so now they've ticked what the diagnosis is, and it comes up as the most probable diagnosis is what we now call bipolar disorder. Not a concept they had
At the time?
No, not at all. Any doctor reading that now, it would just shout bipolar at you, it really would.
I'm convinced,
Yes.
but can you tell me what causes it?
I wish I knew. I don't. Nobody knows. What we do know is there's very compelling evidence that what we call life events, so major traumas in your life, bereavement or being a victim of crime or, divorcing, something like that. It doesn't cause bipolar disorder, but what it does do, it will then trigger an episode and you'll have a full-blown illness. So it's sensitive to what's going on in our environment.
Is there a particular life stage at which people generally start to experience it for the first time?
Yes, it usually starts in younger people, so the peak age is somewhere between 20 and 30.
So if George had it, we could expect perhaps to see some evidence of this in his 20s.
He had an episode in 1765. It's unclear what it was, and the records, as I understand it, simply have never been found.
This earlier episode, in 1765, is intriguing. George was 50 when he had his first documented bout of illness in 1788. But if bipolar disorder usually strikes between 20 and 30, were there earlier signs? Here's George in his coronation robes in 1760. He was just 22. Doesn't he look young, but full of confidence? It was only a few years after this, in 1765, that we get this mysterious incident of illness when he disappeared from public life for a while. And there are now quite a few historians who are suggesting that this was perhaps his first experience of the mental illness that would come back with a vengeance in 1788. There are tantalising clues that the royal family was covering something up. The daughter of the king's hairdresser, Charlotte Pappendick, wrote later, "It was Her Majesty the Queen's wish to prevent the public from discovering the nature of the king's illness." But this is all gossip, not fact. I can't find any doctor's notes in the Georgian papers, but there is this. Now here's a really fascinating nugget of information from 1765. George has called in his ministers to a meeting, and he tells them he wants to make plans for a regency. He wants to make provision for the administration of government in case of a minority, which God prevent. So that means should George die or become incapacitated, and if his children weren't old enough to take over, what would happen? He wanted his wife or his mother to step in as monarch. Now, this could be a complete coincidence, but the timing suggests to me otherwise. Perhaps this year George realised that there was something seriously wrong with him, something that might stop him from doing his job as king. If the trail runs cold here, let's leave the younger George and move forward to 1788 and George's first official bout of illness. If episodes of bipolar disorder can be triggered by traumatic events or extreme stress, what was happening in George's personal life in the run-up to 88? There's something at the Royal Academy I want to see. By 1783, George had 15 children. The older ones, particularly the Prince of Wales, were causing him all sorts of trouble with their overspending and their womanizing, but he really doted on the two littlest boys. Tragically, George's toddler, 2-year-old Alfred, died suddenly. Then 8 months later, 4-year-old Octavius died too. Infant death was common, so you might think parents were used to dealing with this kind of loss. This is such a poignant image. It's an engraved copy of a painting George had done to commemorate his 2 lost little boys. This is Prince Alfred, who died first, and he's in heaven already, and he's welcoming in his brother, Prince Octavius. Octavius dies, and this angel's here to look after them both. George had the original of this on the wall of his bedchamber, so that when he woke up in the morning, the first thing he'd see were his lost sons. That alone, I think, speaks volumes about what this loss meant to him. It seems to me that this could have been a trigger for his breakdown in 1788. But to prove it, I need a window into George's mind. You might think that's impossible, but I've come to Kew Gardens, the playground of Octavius and Alfred, to meet a professor who's doing something unique. He's examining George's hallucinations and delusions. How do you know what the king's delusions were?
Well, we have very few direct records of what the king says, but we do have what the pages and attendants who were looking after the king when he was asleep or over the night told the doctors the next morning. From those, you get these often very brief references to things that he is said to have believed or imagined, but which, when you put them together, is quite a substantial body of material that just lets you see inside the king's mind, really.
And do you think you can see evidence of specific trauma, bad things that happened to him in his life, that you see sort of being processed through these delusions?
Well, there are particular incidents relating to his children. He was a very devoted father, and when they were lost at different phases of his life, they then reappear to him in his delusions, in really very moving ways, actually.
What sort of delusions is he having about his lost children?
There's a very particularly moving incident that takes place on Christmas Eve, 1788. So this particular night, what the king records is thinking that the pillow of his bed is Octavius, who's come back. And
this is so awfully sad.
It's all then described here.
It says he had the pillow in the bed with him, which he called Prince Octavius, who he said was to be newborn this day. The reason this is so upsetting is because you just have the image of him holding the pillow like it was the baby.
That's the recurring trope, actually, for the king, because when his daughter Amelia dies from TB, after she's dead, he begins to imagine having conversations with her and that she's had holes drilled in her coffin and in fact survived burial and has come back to talk to him after that. That's a very strange delusion, which again echoes this earlier incident with Octavius. The fact that this comes up in his delusions, not only in this illness but in his later illness too, suggests that that's the trigger.
Harper, do you feel that this research is giving you a really extraordinary insight into the mind of a king?
There's a sense in which one of the things that's happening to him in his illness is he becomes disinhibited and will actually perhaps articulate things that he otherwise has been suppressing or repressing in his mind.
And in a way, it's his illness, it's his so-called madness that allows us to know him.
Absolutely. We don't get to those bits of his mind otherwise.
I've been left feeling really sad about what Arthur had to say about George's love for his children and his grief for their loss. It's easy to forget that he wasn't just a king, he was also a human being. The death of these children was not marked by formal court mourning. They were considered too young. So George doesn't have this as a way to help him process his loss. He represses his grief, and it clearly festers, bursting out during episodes of mania. It's clear to me there's concrete evidence of personal trauma, which could have triggered a bipolar episode. But I also want to look at the political pressures on George too. I know this was a tricky time to lead a country. George was staring down the barrel of a new world order. An account of the rise and progress of the late tumults. Dead bodies in the streets of London. This is serious stuff. Newspaper headlines from the 1780s reveal a time of huge turmoil. George decided to grant some new rights to Catholics. Seemed like a generous and liberal thing to do, but it went horribly wrong. There were anti-Catholic riots and sectarian violence on the street. This newspaper article here describes a Roman Catholic chapel being set fire to. What they call the mob are out on the streets. They're waving revolutionary flags, actually. Things are on the brink of enormous trouble. The 1780s weren't just an age of reason, but an age of revolution. And it wasn't just Britain that was on the brink. The King of France had faced an assassination attempt, and the American War of Independence was coming to a head. Here's Cornwallis, defeated at Yorktown, doing the Walk of Shame. They're taking down the British flag, and they're putting up the American flag in its place. So George would have hoped to have added to his empire, but instead, he must have felt that he had effectively lost America. These crises coincided with the start of the mass news era. George had nowhere to hide. He was exposed. And I found an extraordinary letter which suggests George was afraid he was failing. Now, this is just the most fascinating document from the Royal Archives of 1782. It's a letter that George III has drafted saying that he's going to hand in his resignation. I am therefore resolved to resign my crown. Extraordinary. No king had abdicated for 1,000 years. And just think of the huge stink that there was when Edward VIII abdicated in the 20th century, at a point when the monarchy was much less politically significant than it was here in the 18th century. George has clearly agonised over his decision. There's all sorts of crossings out and underlinings in his letter. And there's a real sense of alienation here and disillusionment. Now, he never actually sent his letter of resignation to Parliament, but it shows the mind of a king in turmoil. George is under extreme pressure to make monarchy work in this new era. He must evolve or perish. George styled himself as a new, slightly more accessible kind of a king. His line was that he was going to listen to people's grievances and respond to them. Now, ordinary working people didn't have the vote, but they could make political points through giving the king petitions. They were able to take their problems straight to the top. Crowds gathered at the gates of St. James's Palace, waving their petitions, begging the king for help. And in August 1786, something happened that I think must have increased the pressure on his already vulnerable mind. As it says in the newspaper, His Majesty was stepping out of his post chariot, the garden entrance to St. James's, just over there, when the attack was made upon his life. The woman by whom the desperate attempt was made had been observed waiting for the king's arrival for some time.
The woman advanced from the crowd and presented a paper folded in the form of a when the woman aimed a blow with a knife at His Majesty's breast.
Concealed in a piece of paper. The knife cut the king's waistcoat. A council.
The knife was instantly wrested from the woman.
And he hastened into the palace.
The woman was immediately taken into custody and on examination appears to be insane. I'm fascinated by this assassination attempt when a mentally ill woman and a soon-to-be mentally ill king came face to face. Who was she? And how did George react?
This is a woman called Margaret Nicholson. She's a 36-year-old spinster and needlewoman. And she felt that something needed to be done to improve her life. So she petitions the king.
So she's writing him letters saying, "Dear King, I want you to do this for me."
Yeah, well, you know, if only it was that clear.
What
she
sort
wrote
of things?
So here's one of Margaret's petitions. She thought she was due a property settlement of some sort. She thought she was due a decent marriage, possibly to the king himself, if only he'd rid himself of his ghastly foreign wife.
Do you think that she was suffering from some sort of mental health issue?
Well, that's an interesting question. She petitions the king something like 20 times, just between April and August of 1786, by her own testimony. On the 2nd of August 1786, she's clearly had enough, so she turns up one more time. King gets down out of his carriage. She's ushered towards the king. I expect they've all seen her before. They know who she is. And she's got her little piece of paper again, but the piece of paper this time conceals a dagger.
Yeah.
And then immediately, and this is the interesting thing, I think, he immediately says, the poor woman is mad. Do not hurt her. And we know he said that straight away because just about 2 hours later, one of the young pages who'd been attending the king testifies these were the words the king used.
Do you think